Invention and innovation. Invention is the creation of a new tool, system, or process based on a law of science to better our way of living. Innovation is the enhancement of the invention by adding new features and functionality to make the original tool more efficient, expand its feature set, and make it more affordable. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are focusing on inventions across history that had a lasting impact on the history, evolution, growth, and betterment of the human race. Acknowledging the massive impact of the early discovery of fire and the invention of the wheel, let's move on to a time closer to the modern era and start with the printing press. German goldsmith Johannes Gutenberg is credited with inventing the printing press around 1436. His printing press, though, can be considered part invention and part innovation because the concept of printing dates back to China in the 9th century. And Korean bookmakers were printing with movable metal type tools a century before Gutenberg. But Gutenberg's invention is considered impactful because it took the concept of manual printing to a mass production paradigm. Gutenberg's printing press employed a screw-type wine press to squeeze down evenly on the inked metal type. And the result was about 250 pages being printed per hour. In that time, that was huge. And the first book to be printed on the new printing press was the Bible in Latin. Unfortunately, while he was able to produce 200 copies of the Bible, Gutenberg did not have a distribution network. And unfortunately, Gutenberg died penniless with his presses impounded by his creditors because he was unable to sell the printed material. It took other printers some time to figure out the ideal location for setting up a distribution network. And the ideal location was the port town of Venice. And all of a sudden, if you printed 200 copies of a book, you could sell 5 to the captain of each ship leaving the port. And all of a sudden, the printed material started showing up at different port towns across the globe. Since literacy rates were still very low, locals would gather at the pub to hear a paid reader recite the content from the printed material. And one of the favorite topics was the latest news. And that slowly led to the concept of reading or listening to the daily news. The biggest impact of the printing press, though, was on science itself. With the newfound ability to publish and share scientific findings and experimental data with a much wider audience, science really took off in the 16th and the 17th centuries, and scientists like Galileo, Copernicus, and Kepler saw themselves achieving fame far and wide across the globe. However, more than the spread of the scientific information across the globe, it is felt that the printing press ensured the accuracy of the data that was copied. Scientists no longer had to worry about the accuracy of the formulas and the mathematical tables in their hand. Another Chinese invention that had a significant impact was the compass, the device that allowed humankind to navigate the earth. The compass was invented in China between the 4th century BC and 3rd century AD during either the Han or the Tang dynasties. Before the advent of the compass, geographical positions and directions at sea were primarily determined by sighting landmarks or the relative position of celestial bodies like the pole star. And on cloudy days and nights, even that became overcomplicated. The very early compasses were made of a magnetized needle which was attached to a piece of wood or cork that floated freely in a dish of water. As the needle settled, the marked end would point towards the magnetic north. Interestingly, it was called the south pointing fish. The immediate impact of the compass was that China was able to rapidly expand and create trade routes across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, Mesopotamia, Persian Gulf, and the Horn of Africa. Between the 4th and the 8th century AD, China witnessed a rapid expansion of trade, and this clearly was a byproduct of the invention and adoption of the compass as a navigational instrument. Over time, the compass made its way westward during the 11th century to eventually end up in the Arabic and European countries. However, for nearly 800 years, only China and other parts of Asia had access to the compass. There's no clear data point on how the compass made it to Europe. Many believe that the Italian traveler Marco Polo brought the compass to Europe when he returned from his trip to China around 1274. Although Marco Polo mentions the compass in his book, The Description of the World, in which he captured his experience and observations during his trip to China, but there is no evidence that he brought a compass back to Europe. The first known construction of a compass for navigation in Europe occurred in the city-state Amalfi, south of Naples, Italy. Around 1300 AD, Amalfi was the primary port in Italy, and a monument in the city does commemorate the city being the site of the invention of the navigational compass. The compass in Europe had two major areas of impact with respect to trade and discovery. By the end of the 13th century, the practice of parking ships for winter to avoid the cloudiness was no longer a problem, and with the compass, the ships could now make 2 or more trips through the year, irrespective of the season. And as the sailors became more confident, by the 15th century, voyages turned more to the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The Portuguese began by gradually feeling their way down the coast of Africa, rounding around the Cape of Good Hope and braving the unknown as they sailed into the Indian Ocean. And the first to accomplish this feat and open an all-water route to India was Vasco da Gama in 1497. And around the same period, Columbus made 3 of his 4 voyages to the New World. And the opening up of the long-distance sea routes led to the second area of impact, which was the establishment of trade in silk, tea, and spices with the Orient. Of the 10 million soldiers killed in World War I, about half died not from bombs or shrapnel or bullets, but from untreatable infections from relatively minor wounds and injuries. And then, in 1928, an accidental discovery by Alexander Fleming led to the formulation of the first solution to fight bacterial infections: penicillin. After arriving back to his London laboratory, Following a 2-week vacation in 1928, Alexander Fleming noticed that there was a zone around an invading fungus on an agar plate in which bacteria did not grow. After examining the mold, he noticed that it belonged to an active agent called penicillin. And that made him conclude that penicillin had an antibacterial effect on the bacteria in the agar plate. As war broke out in Europe in 1939, Australian doctor Howard Florey obtained funding from the Rockefeller Foundation in New York to study Alexander Fleming's discovery further at the University of Oxford with the prime purpose of making it commercially viable. As the World War II became more intense, labs around the world got word of the Oxford Labs' penicillin research and began requesting samples. The Oxford team's challenge now was to ensure that none of the samples accidentally landed in the hands of German scientists. The Oxford scientists realized that the United States had not entered the war yet, and they tried to pursue the Rockefeller Foundation to convince some of the US pharma companies to mass produce penicillin. By the fall of 1941, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, Merck, and other drug firms had agreed to work towards the mass production of penicillin. And then in December of 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the US joined the war. All of a sudden, penicillin was no longer a scientific issue, it was a medical necessity. Merely 10 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, pharmaceutical companies in the United States began escalating penicillin production using a process called deep tank fermentation to extract the drug from mold. As they looked for the most potent penicillin mold that could hold up during the fermentation process, the USDA lab in Peoria had a lab assistant, Mary Hunt, frequent local markets for decaying fruit or anything with fungal growth. That earned her the nickname Moldy Mary, but she was able to find a cantaloupe with a mold so powerful that in time it became the ancestor of most of the penicillin produced in the world. And subsequently, throughout 1943, penicillin production became the War Department's number 2 priority after the Manhattan Project to build the nuclear bomb. The plan now was for the widespread distribution of penicillin stocks to Allied troops fighting in Europe. And the ultimate goal was to have enough to support the D-Day invasion. And on June 6, 1944, 73,000 US troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, boosted by millions of doses of penicillin. The discovery of penicillin changed the course of modern medicine significantly because some life-threatening infections like tonsillitis, bronchitis, and pneumonia were now easily treated. In World War II alone, the death rate from bacterial pneumonia in soldiers decreased from 18% to just 1%. And most important of all, it led to the creation of over 100 other antibiotics, which helped save people from several other life-threatening diseases. The era of long-distance communication really started with the telegraph. In the year 1800, Italian physicist Alessandro Volta invented the battery, which reliably stored an electric current and allowed the current to be used in a controlled environment. And then in 1820, Danish physicist Hans Christian Ørsted demonstrated the connection between electricity and magnetism by deflecting a magnetic needle with an electric current. And all of a sudden, scientists and inventors across the world began experimenting with batteries and the principles of electromagnetism to figure out some kind of communication system. In the 1830s, the British team of Cooke and Wheatstone developed a telegraph system with 5 magnetic needles, and these could be pointed around a panel of letters and numbers by using an electric current. This system started getting used for railroad signaling in Britain. And around the same time, Massachusetts-born, Yale-educated Samuel Morse worked to develop an electric telegraph of his own. In collaboration with 2 other scientists, Morse eventually produced a single-circuit telegraph that worked by pushing the operator key down to complete the electric circuit of a battery. This action sent the electric signal across a wire to a receiver at the other end. And to transmit messages across a telegraph wire, Morse and his team created what came to be known as Morse code. The code assigned letters in the alphabet and numbers, a set of dots and dashes. And this was based on the frequency of use of letters. So letters such as E that were used often got a simple code, whereas those that were used infrequently, such as Q, got a longer and more complex code. Initially, the code, when transmitted over a telegraph system, was rendered as marks on a piece of paper that the telegraph operator would translate back into English. But very quickly, the operators began to hear and understand the code just by listening to the clicking of the receiver. So the paper was replaced by a receiver that created more pronounced beeping sounds that the operators could hear more clearly. In 1843, Samuel Morse and his associate Whale received funding from US Congress to set up and test their telegraph system between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. And on May 24, 1844, Morse sent Whale the historic first message, "What hath God wrought?" The telegraph system subsequently spread across America, and the Western Union Telegraphy Company was founded in 1856. By 1861, Western Union had laid the first transcontinental telegraph line, making it the first nationwide telegraph company. By 1866, the first intercontinental telegraph cable had been successfully laid across the Atlantic Ocean. And by 1940, there were 40 such telegraph lines across the Atlantic. The telegraph ushered the communication age in the world, and it transformed diplomacy, how wars were fought, how money was sent, and how newspapers transmitted news from one region to the other. News and information could now be exchanged between telegraph stations almost instantly. On the economic front too, telegraph had a big impact because it allowed money to be wired across great distances. Earlier, the big banking family, the Rothschilds, had developed a communication system based on couriers and carrier pigeons, which connected the main European economic centers. With telegraph coming in, the whole communication network was democratized, and other banks no longer had this competitive disadvantage. The biggest impact, though, was on diplomacy itself. It was in the 1850s that the telegraph started to be used as a tool in diplomatic services, specifically for internal communications between diplomatic missions and headquarters. During the Congress of Paris in 1856, British representatives received instructions from Prime Minister Palmerston through coded telegrams. Margaret Sanger, the founder of American Birth Control League, the precursor to today's Planned Parenthood, had an idea in her head of a magic pill women could use for contraception. She recruited medical experts in human reproduction to help her develop the birth control pill. Her efforts bore fruit on June 23, 1960, when the FDA approved the first birth control pill, Enovid, manufactured by CERN. And once that happened, the pill sparked a social and an economic revolution. And as access to the pill increased, women in America started enrolling themselves in law, medicine, and business institutions, areas which were previously heavily male-dominated. In 1970, medical degrees were over 90% male. Law degrees and MBAs were about 95% male. But by 1980, most of these classes had women attendance up to a third. And this led to the proportion of women in professions going up as well. But what did the pill have to do with all this? Well, by giving women control over their fertility, it allowed them to invest in their careers. So women could get married or have a partner at any time, but it was up to them to decide when they wanted to start a family. And as each state opened up access to contraception, women enrollment in professional courses rose, and so did their wages. Between 1970 and 1990 alone, there was about a 15% bump in the women's labor force participation. And this figure has been directly attributed to access to the pill. So the net biggest impact of the pill was that just like men, women could plan their careers. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. What UN member states have never signed the NPT, or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? Among the long-term UN members, India, Pakistan, and Israel have never signed the NPT. So the answer is D, India, Pakistan, and Israel. Question for the current episode. AT&T, the acronym stands for American Telephone and Telegraph. So the question is, when did AT&T stop offering telegraph service? Is it A, 1960, B, 1991, C, 2012, or D, 1975? Once again, when did AT&T stop offering telegraph service? A, 1960, B, 1991, C, 2012, or D, 1975? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we take a deeper look at the history of Europe and try to figure out why it seems to be perpetually at war. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.